Yvette Montero Salvatico. I'm a futurist and co-owner of Kedge LLC, a foresight, innovation, and strategic design firm. We're based out of Orlando, Florida, though I'm rarely here. We travel a great bit, and our clients include folks like Disney and Procter & Gamble and Daimler Automotive, and we're really eager to help people make sense of the future and take ownership of that process as opposed to sort of letting the future happen to them. I spent a good amount of my career, 13 years, working for the Walt Disney Company, and it wasn't towards the tail end of my journey with them that I discovered strategic foresight. Sort of ironic because I did finance for them. So I did a lot of strategic planning and 5-year planning, but I never knew that there was a field that was created to allow us to provide frameworks to think about the future in a more structured way. I thought the way that you planned for the future was you threw a bunch of numbers in Excel, you said a prayer, you lit a candle, and you went about your business. So I didn't realize that there was all these tools and methodologies, but more importantly, really a mindset to think about the future. So futurists help organizations and individuals plan for the future and think about the future in a more collaborative and purposeful way. So right now, most organizations sort of relegate planning for the future to a once-a-year exciting event called the 5-year plan or the AOP, or they have various names, but it's definitely a finance-led effort. Most people hide when it comes time to do the 5-year plan, and they hope just not to be involved in the process. And what we try to help people understand is that really the future is not about the future is about today. And the decisions we make today are framed directly by the way we think about the future. So the way we think about the future directly impacts the decisions we make today. And it's not surprising that people want to avoid the future. They say through psychological experiments that our reaction to uncertainty, what's more uncertain than the future, our reaction to uncertainty is physical nausea. So we want to throw up. And so it's not surprising that people sort of avoid uncertainty. They create these spreadsheets to create a false sense of security. They have, column that says the year 2020 and a profit and loss. So they feel, even though they know it's wrong, the numbers aren't going to be that. They just feel sort of this false sense of security, this warm blankie. But we try to show them that there's another way. And so that's what futurists do. Is use the field of strategic foresight, which is a discipline. You can get your master's degree or PhD in it. But our belief is that you don't need to get those degrees. And that, in fact, everyone needs to think like a futurist, regardless of what position they hold and what role they have in an organization, that the volatility is such that everybody needs to think this way. Although foresight is a discipline, and we really feel it's best served as a philosophy or a mindset, right? And so, yes, there's a toolkit, and I do employ a lot of those tools that we share with our clients. We employ internally, but ultimately, it's really about the mindset and about having the perspective that we're all creating the future. I'm creating the future with every decision I make. And so what I try to do is be more mindful about the decisions I'm making and really the vision and the aspiration I'm trying to achieve. So always keeping in mind ultimately what my goal is, whether that's a personal goal or a professional goal. I think we don't spend enough time thinking about our aspirations, and especially organizationally, but even personally. A lot of strategic foresight can be applied to you as an individual. And so without that sort of beacon of where you're headed, of course you're going to make crappy decisions. Of course your decisions aren't going to be aligned with where you want to head. You're not thinking about that aspiration. So it's not easy. It's very common for those short-term deliverables to take precedent over those long-term perspectives. But if we realize that all of those short-term wins or losses or decisions add up to that long-term view, that helps, certainly. But I think just a conscious realization, just the conscious realization that every decision I make today is creating the future, that alone helps set the perspective that I want, which is keeping an eye on what that aspirational goal is, whether it's a mid or long-term goal, whether it's personal or professional, and that helps align my decision-making every day. But even while working for the Walt Disney Company, I was doing strategic foresight towards the end, and so I had to make the decision, and I think there was this well-worn path of staying with the organization. I was very successful. It was basically being offered an executive position. There was really very little doubt almost where my future was going to go. It was very clear what that path was. Now, of course, no one really knows what the future is going to hold, but like I said, that was a much more well-worn path. The Disney company is filled with very brilliant, tenured individuals. So as I could see, I could follow their path. It was very clear. And then there was this other path that was not well-worn, that was, not very illuminated, but I could tell from a passion perspective really ignited something in me. And what I learned over the last couple of years at Disney, when I was allowed to sort of launch this new division focused on the future, was two things. Number one, I love the future. I didn't know. And two, I loved the entrepreneurial aspect of creating something from scratch. And you very rarely get that opportunity within a large organization such as Disney. So armed with those two very personal observations and realizations, I made the decision to go down the less worn path, the less illuminated path. Ultimately, what I wanted was to be fulfilled. That was my aspirational goal. I loved Disney. I have the privilege to say that I work more for Disney now than I worked for them when I worked directly for them, because I work for all the divisions. But even if that weren't the case, I would always look fondly back on the time that I spent with Disney, and I learned a ton. But I was never really fulfilled. I was never really it didn't fill my cup completely. I think for a time it did, and towards the end it was just I kept looking for that next thing, and it wasn't for lack of challenge or lack of brilliant people to work with, but I just felt like I wasn't living my passion and directing sort of my path, and so that's what the entrepreneurship piece lends to me, and that's the decision that I made. We often forget that organizations are made up of people. It's like somewhere along the way, the Industrial Revolution took hold, and we became cogs in the machine, and organizations became people, which they're not. I mean, they're made up of people. And I think recognizing that the individual leaders all bring their own perspectives, their own experiences, their own values, their own spirituality to decision making is really relevant. And I think too many people sort of ignore that aspect, which is crazy to me. Because while organizational structure and organizational biases exist, ultimately, with the volatility we're seeing in the environment, the decision making has been pushed down so far. And those daily decisions, I laugh because I always ask my clients, who's in charge of your social media accounts? Like, who's running your Twitter account? And the answer typically is the intern. And I laugh because I think you realize that one person is 140 characters away from completely sinking your brand. And they've been through maybe 3 hours of training around your culture, and they have no clue. But they don't realize the impact that these decentralized technology-enabled peer-to-peer networks are having on organizations and transparency and all of those impacts. So never before has it been more critical for us to look at the individual. So our leaders are facing incredibly complex environments with unbelievable volatility and change, uncertainty, ambiguity, you name it. And yet we're not equipping them with the tools to be able to deal with that. So every decision they're making, whether it's talent, certainly infrastructure, but even the smaller decisions have huge ramifications and ripple effects. And I think the major issue they're having is that it's often at odds with sort of what's on the wall, so to speak, from an organizational culture perspective, and how do they manage that? The top 10 trend lists that come out are of limited usefulness for a couple of reasons. One, somewhere along the way, the word trend became synonymous with the future, but in fact, trends are already here, so they're not the future. Of course, their trajectory or their momentum can tell us something about the future, but what tends to happen is people just use these top 10 trend lists to sound really smart at cocktail parties. Around this time of year is when they start coming out. You can talk about 3D printing and the sharing economy, and you can impress all your friends, but they're of limited usefulness to decision making. What we really need to understand is collision of those trends and ultimately the values undergirding them. So trends don't get created in a petri dish or in a test tube in a laboratory. Trends are created because there's some significant societal shift in values. People change their perspectives, and so they change their behavior. And so rather than talk about specific trends or even the patterns that I see forming, let me talk a little bit about some of the value shifts that I think are critical. And if organizations can focus on the value shifts, it's really interesting what happens. Because then it's not a question of the top 10 trend list, and it's not a question of whether the trends are impacting their industry yet. If they understand the value shifts, then that prepares them for what could be next. And it's not just threats. I mean, we're really an opportunity-driven firm. I think, that classic quote is, a threat is an opportunity you didn't see soon enough, really holds value. And you can only go so far with people helping them think about the future using scare tactics. You get a knee-jerk reaction if you tell them all the scary things are going to happen. But if you want a long-term reaction, if you want long-term impact, you need to talk about opportunity development and transformation. So we talk to people all the time about not just learning continually, but unlearning. So it's learn, unlearn, relearn, right? And people are starting to value that. I can't wait to see how sort of employment is redefined. It's already being redefined, and we're at the leading edge of it. But I mean, really, the idea that you have a vendor versus an employee is sort of ridiculous. It's really all one pool of knowledge. We've added these sort of industrial age labels to them, which causes the problems later down the way when we're dealing with openness. So I can't wait to see how organizations really begin to redefine their networks around these new values of openness and knowledge. And seeing how it redefines, organizations in total. And the future's not about technology. The future's about people. It's about how they're going to misuse technology, but also how they're going to create new social structures and how they're going to change political systems. It's across all realms, but ultimately it's human-centric. It should be human-centric. And so I think we just forget, we put our other hats on, and we forget that ultimately, again, circling back, that organizations aren't organizations. They're made up of individual people. And again, at the end of the day, we want to help people, but ultimately those that will survive the next 10 or 15 years are the ones that are going to figure it out. And there will be many that we consider, really big brands that will not weather this storm because they can't quite get their head around the fact that the world is changing.